Plato's Allegory of the Cave is a really profound piece of writing, one that I've usually included within the scope of primary sources for essay number one. Because we only have 8 weeks to go over 16 weeks worth of work, I've stripped it out. It's not going to be part of essay number one. However, it is still extremely important, and I want to go over it. The first thing, the reason I think it's so important is it really aligns with a lot of our SLOs, our student learning objectives. Now, these are not things I came up with. This is how we kind of codify this class and ensure that when you're taking this advanced writing and critical thinking, that it's going to be consistent with what other people are covering. And so the areas that I think are important within this are specifically the type of reasoning that's utilized. We have inductive or inferential reasoning, which is being utilized by the people in the cave. They have a limited amount of information and they're extrapolating from it some false ideas, but it's still kind of important to kind of consider that in the scope of critical thinking. The other thing is, if we consider it from the idea of a Tolman model of argumentation, which is something that we're going to get into, we can kind of think about it in the sense that their premises or their evidence is incomplete, and therefore they draw really crazy ideas from them. So I've mentioned in previous videos, I think, that one of the more important aspects of anything that you're about to read is the situation from which it comes. You want to look at the rhetorical context. You know, who wrote it, when they wrote it, why they wrote it, how it was written. Are they addressing a question of the time, the zeitgeist, for example? Is it in response to something? Getting the historical perspective on a piece of writing will oftentimes yield quite a bit of information. And the allegory of the cave is no different in this sense. What we have is a Greek piece of writing. This is coming from Plato, Aristotle. The Greeks in general, 2,000 years ago, were very concerned about rhetoric and how to utilize it in terms of argumentation. So, from their considerations, we obviously get the rhetorical triangle, which you should have already covered in your previous class, which is just a means by which we evaluate the effectiveness of rhetoric. If I talk about the rhetorical triangle, again, that is how I want you to kind of consider it. It is not just ethos, pathos, and logos. Those are points of the triangle, but it is not the triangle itself. I'm trying not to get into a lecture on the rhetorical triangle. So we have to consider, where did this even come from? This all stems from the Peloponnesian Wars. This is when Sparta, a little tiny unsophisticated nation, was able to beat up on Athens and really defeat them in war. And it really caused quite a bit of consternation and self-reflection on the part of the Greeks. They started to kind of reconsider, what's going on? Why are we kind of stumbling? And as Plato or Aristotle started to kind of consider what was happening within their government and the way the population was governing itself, they look and saw that rhetoric, specifically in terms of sophism, the sophists were really perverting the idea of argumentation in ways that was really just built strictly on the idea of winning arguments. It wasn't about the discovery of truth. It was really about just manipulative tricks and rhetorical tricks in order to subvert an opponent. And you can kind of see that's still an issue today as people kind of are manipulative or utilizing propaganda in ways not necessarily to convince somebody into another line of thinking, but rather to drive them into fear or manipulate them into thinking the way that they want them to think. So Plato, Socrates, they had these ideas on rhetoric that they really felt that genuine knowledge and enlightenment was the way that a true quest for truth would eventually reveal itself. What we have within the allegory of the cave is a dialogue. Now, the dialogue is an interplay where they have this conversation and they can ask each other questions. And Plato's realistic idea on this was that it's a little weird. Everybody already knows everything, they just forgot that they know it. And so through a dialogue, you could kind of be coaxed into remembering, oh my gosh, I just remembered trigonometry. Never studied it before, but now that you're asking me how to do it, I am kind of getting some remembrance, some familiarity on this. You can see this very specifically play out within Menlo, which is, or Meno, which is Plato kind of going through teaching somebody how to do like geometric arithmetic, reminding them that, hey, you already know this stuff. So it's kind of interesting. But through this dialogue, what the hope is that we can arrive at the virtues being truth. So we'll get into all of that. The main thing is to understand this is an allegory. So we break down the different components within the allegory as having some type of significance or reference to something else within our society. And through this dialogue, we can look at the interplay of these different things within the allegory and see what they represent and how they kind of yield some kind of knowledge within us. As it doesn't work as like we already knew it and we forgot, but through the dialogue, it does allow us to kind of think about it and develop some thought in regards to how it's working, how it's functioning, and what the main point is. So, in this allegory, what we eventually get to is the idea that, looking at the shadows that are cast on the wall, which you will get into, is a false reality that's being perpetuated by somebody else, very specifically in terms of manipulation. Now, the people that are casting the shadow in the allegory would be the sophists. They're utilizing their trickery in order to manipulate the masses. But Plato is going to allow the prisoners to break free, go out into the sunlight, the true sunlight. And what he's pointing to is the virtues. Now, the virtues are stuff like truth or love or honor, these epitome of ideas of virtuous adjectives, virtuous traits by which we can kind of aspire to. And so we want to aspire to truth. And that's where we're going with that. So, um, again, there is a lot within this where we get SLO, student learning outcomes. Again, that's why a lot of this is worthwhile for me to continue to utilize this so we can start to consider inductive versus deductive reasoning, getting into inferences and how we can kind of look at that. Later, when we look at Tolman model, we have different components here where we can see, the premise and the evidence are incomplete. So these are important points that we want to kind of bring back later. Again, we're accumulating all of these ideas, not in a vacuum, but with the idea that we're going to be able to utilize it as we interpret text, utilize it as we construct our own arguments, as we start to orchestrate our own investigations in pursuit of truth, and then constructing our own arguments and conveying these within our arguments or within our essays. So it's not a moot point. These are things that I want you to consider, and I want you to be able to have available for you as we get to the culminative essay, number 4, where we're going to interpret something utilizing all of the ideas that we've gone over throughout this course. And so I really want you to pay attention to these things as we move forward. So thanks.